and it killed off all those other side projects. Alright everyone, hello and welcome to episode 15 of the Screenplay Archaeology Podcast. I am your host, Pyramid Head, and today I am recording another solo episode because I decided after doing two relatively intensive episodes for different reasons, I wanted to do something relatively simple and quick. So I'm going to do a one script episode, and I picked from my pile a potential script for a Highlander remake written by Art Markham and Matt Holloway. And it's dated January of 2009. I forget the exact date at the moment. And the storyline for this script is more or less just a pretty simple remake of the original, but with its own ideas thrown in, so it kind of becomes its own beast. So it's a weird, similar yet different sort of thing. And it more or less follows the same plot of Connor MacLeod, a warrior from the Scottish Highlands in the 16th century, is mortally wounded in battle with a mysterious warrior whom we come to know as the Kurgan, and then he seemingly dies, but then mysteriously comes back to life, and gets driven from his village, and eventually becomes mentored by another man called Ramirez, who reveals to him that they are two members of this race of immortals who have been around since the beginning of time, and they can only be killed if their head is cut from their bodies, and they don't fight on holy ground for superstitious reasons, and they believe that eventually they'll be drawn together in this thing called the Gathering, where they will fight until only one remains, hence the sort of catchphrase, there can be only one. And so you have that stuff in the past, and it alternates with what in this script is the present day, with Connor MacLeod now going by the name of Russell Nash, who's a history professor in New York in this version, and he's been trying to give up the sword essentially and live a peaceful life, but it all sort of comes to a head when other immortals show up in town, most notably the Kurgan, whom he believed was dead, but is actually wasn't, was just out of commission for a bit, and I'll get to that later. And so what appears to be the Gathering takes place, and so Connor has to, end his feud with the Kurgan in New York. And so yeah, to talk about just sort of the franchise in general, it's one of those weird things where they made one really, really great movie, because I do think the original Highlander, even with its weird little flaws that it has, is a great film. And then they had no idea what to do with it after that. So you have some things that kind of work, but most of it just doesn't work at all. And it's so weird how you can have a really, really damn good movie and then make a completely crap franchise out of it, except for one or two other things. And to talk about the original movie, it's one of those movies where it's so self-assured and stylistic and tells such an interesting story that even the little bits of it that shouldn't work, like some honestly kind of weird casting when you think about it, they do. And that just adds to this whole charm to it. There's just something fascinating about the story of people who live through centuries of history, and their only purpose in existence is simply to kill each other for some vaguely defined prize. And it's filled with really good performances, like Christopher Lambert, even though it's weird that they hired like a Franco-Swiss actor to play a Scottish Highlander when Sean Connery's in the scene right next to him. He gives a really good, heartfelt performance, and you can see just the weight of this long life bearing down on him throughout it, and he does a tremendous job selling that. And Sean Connery as Ramirez, it's a smaller part for him, and yeah, it's weird that you have the actual Scottish guy playing a Spaniard in a movie about a Scottish guy who's, well, he's not a Spaniard, he's actually Egyptian. Yeah, he's existed since ancient Egypt, which is one of those things like, damn, make a prequel about that dude. But he gives a really strong performance and gets some of the best lines in the movie. He gets the opening little monologue introducing the concept of immortality. And he's just really, really good in it. He gets one of my favorite lines where MacLeod asks him, how did it happen? He says, why does the sun come up, or are the stars just pinholes in the curtain of night? No one knows. It's just such a great little explanation of immortality, which explains nothing because you can't ever really explain it, which is something the sequels really should have listened to. And Clancy Brown as the Kurgan is just insanely over the top and fun to watch. He's hammy as hell, but it really works for the character who's supposed to just be this utter savage who is carrying the ideas of a tribe from way, way back in history and just bringing them through to the modern age and just giving like a different. It's hard to describe. It's like this primitive savagery that has come from way back in the past, and he's carrying this this ideal forward into the future. I find that very fascinating, and just his whole contempt for just about everything. Anything, everything, everyone. He just does not give a shit, and he's amazing in the role, and just fascinating to watch. And just the look of the character and the voice and that weird sword that he has, which like connects together like it's made out of Legos. I'm not really sure how that works, but that's really cool. And he just makes for a strong villainous performance, even if you never really find out that much about him. Just the idea of him just being a primitive savage in a modern setting is incredibly cool, and I know I took way too many words to describe that concept, but whatever. And just the style of it, where it will flip back and forth between flashbacks of like these cool transitions, I really like that, and I like the way they shoot, the modern New York City stuff. It has this gritty kind of street level feel, which kind of contrasts with the way the past footage looks. It's just a really, really damn good movie with some great 80s montages in it, like the training montage with Connor and Ramirez, and the Who Wants to Be Forever montage, where you're watching Connor and his wife Heather living through their lives, and then she dies of old age, and it's set to the Queen music, which the Queen music is awesome as well. It's a shame there was never an official soundtrack for the movie, because that would have been badass. And even though Christopher Lambert didn't know how to use a sword, the action scenes still look pretty cool, and it's just a really good movie that's worth watching. And then the whole thing with the one thing in the movie that really, really doesn't work is the romance Connor has with this modern day woman, Brenda Wyatt, who's this police forensics woman who goes after him, and she's also kind of a sword historian. It's weird. It's not the greatest love story ever put to film, and it's kind of clunky, but it's okay. It's just not the strongest thing, especially when the romance in the past of Connor and Heather works really, really well, and then that just kind of falls flat by comparison. But yeah, the first Highlander movie is something you really should look out for and give it a watch, because it's one of those films that's kind of, forgotten and fallen by the wayside. It has its strong cult following. It never really got picked up by many other audiences, really, so it's definitely worth a look. Now, the sequels, and this is going to be increasingly complicated to talk about, just because it seems like every single one of these sequels, bar Highlander 3, has at least 2 different versions of it floating around. And they started off with Highlander 2, and I'm guessing the movie did well enough on, like, HBO and on VHS to, like, make them think about doing a sequel. And, because the first movie was not a theatrical success, it bombed pretty badly. But I guess they figured, there's enough interest, we'll make a sequel, and so the problem being, the ending of the first movie is pretty damn final, because Connor McLeod actually does win the prize at the end. So they had to get creative to continue that. And so I'm guessing Russell Mulcahy and the producers and the writers just went, fuck it, let's get nuts with this. So they introduced this plot that's set in a dystopian cyberpunk future, where Connor McLeod had to save the world from decreasing ozone layer by building a massive planetary shield which blocks out the sun, and does other vague stuff to the planet which isn't really explained, and then the shield somehow gets taken over by a corporation where it's like, okay, how do they make any money at all? And then it's revealed that the Immortals are actually aliens who were banished from the planet Zeist. And there's this general on Zeist called Katana, who's played by Michael Ironside, who doesn't like that, so he tries to kill Connor even though he's not a threat anymore. And that doesn't work, and so he comes back, and then it's this plot about destroying the shield, and then somehow Ramirez is brought back to life when he died in the first movie in a means that doesn't make any sense. And it's this plot that, on the one hand, I admire the ballsiness of just going, fuck it, they're aliens. But I don't understand at all the logic behind the alien thing, because it just raises way more questions than it answers. And I just don't get it. It's such a weird thing to do, to just go off in such a lateral direction like that and go, oh, aliens. And no matter how much they try to paper that over with the Renegade cut, and then later on the director's cut, which was like a redone version of the Renegade, where they dub over all the stuff about the aliens and say they're actually from the distant past and they have time travel magic or something, that doesn't change it, and honestly just makes it even more confusing. But it's such a weird way to go, and while I do sort of admire it, it's also just completely baffling and befuddling that anyone would think that was a good idea. And it's a movie that does have a couple of good things about, like, the cast is mostly good. Like, Lambert's still pretty good in it. Sean Connery, even though if it doesn't make any sense for him to be there, he's clearly enjoying himself and gives a pretty good performance. Michael Ironside makes for a good bad guy, as always, and the evil head of the S.H.I.E.L.D. Corporation is John C. McGinley, whom I just love. So it's like, okay, he's awesome in it. And it doesn't help that the theatrical cut is ruined by just awful hack job editing, where like parts of the movie that are supposed to happen later happen earlier, and then two different fight scenes get like edited together into one, so the location radically changes, the character's clothing changes, and Connor has a different sword through different parts of the fight. It doesn't make any sense, and my understanding what happened there is that they decided to film it in Argentina, and then Argentina turned out to have a very unstable currency, so the budget got fucked by that. And then, like, the insurance holding company took over the production and, like, locked Russell Mulcahy out of the editing room. And yeah, the Renegade and Director's Cut, they fixed that, and they fixed, like, the fact that there's a lack of, like, cool transitions in it. It's still a crap movie, and just bafflingly crap at that. It's so weird, I don't even know what to say about it. It's like, oh, they went, okay, aliens. Apparently the movie did well enough in some markets that they decided to move on and do a Highlander TV show that ignored 2 and kind of retconned the ending of the first movie a little bit. And I haven't seen all of it, but I liked what I saw. It was very, 90s, and it was a formulaic sort of television structure to it, but it was a fun show, seeing all these evil immortals, and I liked the new character of Duncan MacLeod, whom, instead of being a darker character like Connor was, he was a little bit more of a brighter, swashbuckling, romantic type, which I liked. And I liked Adrian Paul. And it did some interesting things where it actually did sort of expand the universe a bit, where it introduced this concept of the Watchers, who were a secret society that have been observing the Immortals throughout history and recording their exploits, and they don't interfere. That's why the Immortals never found out about them until the course of the TV show. Pretty good show from what I saw. I definitely want to go back and finish it eventually. But the show was a hit, and so during its run, the producers decided to make Highlander 3, which has various titles, like Highlander The Final Dimension, Highlander 3 The Sorcerer, and like 2 or 3 others depending on what region it was released in. And as a movie and as a sequel, it's the least offensive of all of them, because it's basically just sort of an iffy retread of the original with some really terrible special effects thrown in. But it's not very good either. I've only seen it once, and it's not a very memorable film. But it just has this weird retcon where Connor MacLeod won the prize at the end of the first one, but there were these other immortals trapped in a cave, and then apparently whoever was giving out the prize just forgot about those guys. And so Connor still got it, even though he wasn't the only one left, and so now he has to fight, Kane the Sorcerer, who's Mario Van Peebles, who's basically just a not-as-cool version of the Kurgan. And the movie was just not very good. It just felt like they put it out there as a cash grab. And there's not a whole lot else to say about it. There's this cool bit where Kane tries to start a fight with Connor on holy ground, and then, lightning strikes, and so he pulls back. Oh, okay, so there are consequences for that. That's actually pretty cool. But mostly it's just oh, okay, I saw that in the original, and I liked it better there. Okay, Kane brings a prostitute up to his hotel room. Seen that. Kane takes Connor's loved one and drives really crazily in a car. I've seen that. It's just not anything great. And his whole illusion abilities, which is what they call it, where he can make himself look like he transforms and other stuff, they're really terrible effects. And during their fight scene at the end, Kane gets chopped in half, and you see his body how do you describe it? It kind of moves itself over to the bottom half, and then they re-knit together. It was a really goofy looking effect. Hobbles over to the bottom half. Yeah, that's the word. It was an awful effect. And the movie, it's the least bad of the Highlander films, the live action films. I'll get to that in a second, but it's not very good. It's just blandly inoffensive. That's what it is. It's there. It's a movie that exists. If you want to watch it, go ahead, but it's not worth it. As that came out, it didn't make very much money. The series continued for 6 seasons, and my understanding is that it really goes to shit in the last season because there was a cliffhanger from season 5, and they introduced a demon out of nowhere, and then season 6 is just random shit, like they're trying to set up they're like testing out various concepts for a spin-off, and then they made a spin-off, and apparently that's terrible, but I haven't seen it. And then they decided that series ended, and then the spin-off didn't go anywhere. They decided to wring a few more dollars out of it by making Highlander Endgame, which crossed over the movies with the TV show, promising basically Connor and Duncan fighting side by side, which could be awesome. And then the movie? This is another weird one, because it just... they decided to make it a crossover in which Connor's barely in it, even though the plot revolves around him. And so you're following Duncan, who's just sort of tertiary to the plot and has his own dumb subplot that they gave him in it. And it's filled with just way too many flashbacks, which, yeah, I love the whole flashback structure of the original, but this movie throws in like 50 of them. I'm not even exaggerating there. A bunch of them are like 10 seconds long in some cases. And the movie, like, the plot, it has this interesting hook to it, where it's about this immortal guy who has a grudge against Connor MacLeod, and so is like making his life a living hell and whatnot, and wants revenge. And that's an interesting idea, but the movie does no justice to it, partly because the whole crossing over with the TV show aspect, and because they decided to give Christopher Lambert a limited part. So, like I said, you have this weird movie where the character that the plot revolves around isn't even in it that much. And the guy who is the main character of the movie doesn't have anything to do with the plot, really, aside from this dumb love interest thing. That was stupid. And it just doesn't work, and there's a bunch of things in there where you won't understand it if you haven't seen the TV show. Like, you won't understand anything about Duncan, because they don't tell you. You won't understand anything about who Joe Dawson and the Watchers are, because they don't explain that. Mythos shows up, and I haven't seen his episodes yet, so I don't get him, really. I know a little bit about him from what I've read, but I don't get him in that movie. And then you have things where if you have seen the TV show, it makes even less sense, because they set up this thing with this woman called Faith, who was originally named Kate, and she was Duncan's wife, and then they split up. And that doesn't make any sense, because in the TV show, there was at least one episode which revolved around the fact that Duncan had never been married. And it's just so weird. They just shoved that in there. I don't get it. Once again, that's this whole series. I don't get what you're thinking at all. So yeah, you had that, and that movie's just bad, and they decided to kill off Connor MacLeod in a way that doesn't make any sense, and is just not satisfying at all, and the villain, Jacob Kell, is just, once again, a villain who's trying to be over the top, but not working in the way the Kurgan did, so that just doesn't work. And Bruce Payne, I've liked him in some things, but he's not very good in that movie. And then there's a stupid ending to it, and this is another one which has like multiple different cuts of it, because the theatrical had a ton of scenes cut out of it, and then you have a director's cut, 2 different work print cuts, and a TV cut, which mixes all of them. It's so bizarre how many different versions of a crummy movie there are. So yeah, that movie's not very good. And it really should have been better because, hey, we're bringing the character from a highly successful TV show to the screen. Let's just crap a turd out. I don't understand the logic. And so that sort of put Highlander on ice for a while, for like at least 5 years. And then eventually there was talk of doing... Well, there was a cartoon show in the 90s I neglected to mention, but I don't know much about that, so I won't say anything. But sometime in the 2000s, there started being talk of a new trilogy of movies, a new TV show, and a new video game. And pretty much what happened is that the first of that trilogy of movies, Highlander the Source, got made, sat on a shelf for a couple of years, and then premiered on the Sci-Fi Channel. And that basically did so poorly and had such a poor reaction, it killed off all those other side projects. And Highlander the Source, God, I hope I'm not forgetting anything Highlander related. Highlander the Source it's such a singularly bad movie. That's the best way to describe it, because it's a film where I mean, I don't understand the logic behind any of the choices they made in Highlander 2, but I get I get wanting to explain it, because that's something that somebody would think of. I can see the logic there. I can see the logic of retreading the original film. I can see the logic of doing a cheap, crapped out crossover between the TV show and the movies. I don't see the logic behind anything they did in The Source, because basically what they did is they took the series, took its mythology, put it through a meat grinder, and then took a shit on it, because that's basically what the movie is. I don't even begin to comprehend it. It's this weird plot, once again, about how the world is now in this unexplained post-apocalypse, and these immortals are looking for the source of immortality, where it's never explained what the source is or what it does. And then Duncan's in it, and he once again has this woman who used to be his wife, who we've never heard of before, and just an awful cast, really. I mean, the people who return from the TV show aren't bad in it, but the rest of the cast is just blah, and you have this horrible villain who's the guardian of the source, who is just, once again, trying way too hard to be over the top, to the extent that he basically is just a live-action Looney Tunes character in a bad way, whom he shows up, he has a pretty decent fight scene where he chops a guy's head off, and there's a pretty cool quickening where he absorbs the energy, and then he proceeds to just be the goofiest motherfucker ever, because he shows up, talks to Duncan, and starts doing the whole assuming an accent to make fun of him thing that Hannibal Lecter did in Silence of the Lambs, only here it's shitty. And then he does, he's just talking, and then he gets hit by a truck by Joe Dawson and goes, "Hello, Joe!" And then later on he sings Who Wants to Be Forever for no reason, and he has super speed. That's the only reason he's a threat at all, is because he has, Sonic the Hedgehog speed. Okay, imagine, he's Tasmanian Devil. He's the Tasmanian Devil, only really annoying. And so there's this thing about this thing called the Source, which is on an island somewhere in the Baltic Sea, and they have to fight cannibals, and the Guardian breaks Duncan's katana, and then blah blah blah. There's a horrible cover of Princes of the Universe, and finally, after all this crap, there's a guy in the movie who looks like Albert Wesker for no reason. They get to the Source, and then Anna, this supposed wife of Duncan, she's walking into the light, and there's this goofy ass fight between Duncan and the Guardian, and it's revealed that it's not about killing till there's only one, it's about being pure of heart, and then apparently their reward is to have a child, and that's supposed to be the sequel hook. However, that's the version that's most commonly available on DVD. The original cut of the movie did not have the narration at the end that explains that, so you just get this weird ending where they're making out in bright white light, and it pans up and there's a weird, fetus, it's 2001 or something, and then it ends. So yeah, that movie did not do very well. Can you imagine? It is singularly awful, and I don't know how they looked at that script and went, yep, that's the version we're going with. Especially since apparently there was multiple versions of that were in the scripting phase, and they just went, fuck it, we're not doing that, including one where apparently Duncan lives in the desert and has a pet monk Connor. Yeah, I don't know what to make of that in the slightest. So yeah, that movie was terrible, and it basically killed the franchise to the point where they decided, okay, we're going to do a remake now, and it's different producers making it. But right around the same time The Source came out, there was the anime film Highlander: The Search for Vengeance, which is really only tangentially a Highlander movie in the sense that it just kind of takes the concept and tells its own story. But really, of the movies, it's the only good one aside from the first one. It's not great. The main character, Colin MacLeod, is a little stiff and one note. And there's weird stuff thrown in there because it's an anime, and anime likes to do that, where they'll just throw weird concepts at you and you roll with it because it's anime. But in the context of Highlander, it's why is Colin MacLeod being trained in fighting by a druid ghost? And why is there this weird reincarnation subplot? I don't get that either. And then it's an alright movie though. It's worth a watch. You're not gonna hate it like any of the other movies are. It's an alright little movie. Even if the hero does tend to seemingly survive purely through dumb luck. There's a cool part where one of the evil immortals gets beheaded with a hand grenade shoved down her mouth. That was cool. But yeah, it was an alright little movie. I definitely recommend giving it at least one look. And so I guess that leads us up to this script. This script for Highlander, which basically in 2008, Summit Entertainment, they got the rights to remake Highlander, and they brought in Art Markham and Matt Holloway to write a script because they took part in writing Iron Man, and I guess that made them a hot property, although I wouldn't put too much stock in what they wrote being in that movie, because apparently they didn't have a finalized script when they shot that. It was almost entirely made up on the spot, which is insane, because that movie actually turned out pretty well. But, who knows? So yeah, the other thing they worked on that was notable to me was Punisher Warzone, which I know all they did on that was they they were brought in for a punch-up job on Lexi Alexander's script. They basically rewrote the action scenes and the dialogue and punched it up a bit. So yeah, that's that. And they were only brought into that project because of Iron Man, I'm guessing. Yeah, their script for Highlander, it's weird because in some ways I actually really, really like it. I think it's a solid base to start from, and it could do with some rewrites. However, there are other parts of it that just... There's one really, really, really bad thing in it, which I'll get to because that's the ending. But most of the weird things I don't like about it, it's just it raises too many questions. It's just, like Bruce Wayne says, because it'll be things that they kind of play around with the mythology where I'm like, I don't know what that means. Or I don't know how that makes, or what the... Because the rules here I don't feel like are as well defined as they could be. It's a little strange, but the script, I'd say overall, I think it's a good one. It's an effective sort of little retelling of, the story of Connor, Ramirez, and the Kurgan, with its own little changes. And the way this one begins, because the way the original movie begins, it begins with Connor sitting at Madison Square Garden watching a wrestling match, and while he's watching it, the violence sort of reminds him of battles in the Scottish Highlands, so you get tiny little flashbacks, and he has a fight with an immortal in the parking garage, and then you get the flashback to him dying in battle. And the way this basically just opens up in the 16th century with Connor preparing for battle. And the scene I actually like because the way it's done is that it's very different from what the original movie did in that they found 2 members of the Clan MacLeod dead, and they assumed it was the Clan MacDonald from down the coast was responsible. So they get in their boats ready to go to battle, and they get to the village, and everybody's dead. Men are all dead, the women and children are all dead, and there's one guy standing there with this strange curved blade. The script points out is the type of sword used by tribes on the Russian steppes. And it's the Kurgan standing there who has presumably slaughtered all of these men, women, and children just in his search for this immortal Connor MacLeod. And it's a really eerie atmospheric scene, and they have this little fight where the Kurgan, runs Cloud right through, but then the other clansmen sort of overtake him and they get away, and they put Connor in his little boat and sort of push it off back to their village, and it gets there and MacLeod's body is found and he's dead, presumably. And then it pans over to the water, and then the narration from the beginning of the original movie pops up, or a version of it, and it says it's not read by Ramirez, it's read specifically by Sean Connery. That's what's noted in the script, which I find really weird, because I doubt Sean Connery would come out of retirement to do that. It's really weird, and it feels more like it's throwing a bone to the fans than anything else. It's a good scene on the whole, this whole sequence of him readying himself for battle, even if the various shots of him before revealing his face sort of reminds me a little bit of how Steven Seagal would frame himself in the movie, but it was pretty good. I just think that just beginning straight off with Connor's origin story, I like the way the original movie did it with, beginning in the present day and then flashing back. I feel like that sets up the premise a little bit better, but it is a good scene. It just feels like doing it like that feels less ambitious than the original did. And it does do one little specifically interesting transition back to from past to present, where it pans over to the lake, and then it shifts to a rowing team on the Hudson River in New York in the present day. And one thing that just changes is that when you meet up with Connor MacLeod in the present day, he's working as a history professor at Fordham University, which is a Jesuit university. I'm guessing it's a real place in New York. I don't know for sure. And he's a military historian, which I think is very interesting. And it's playing this kind of really fun sort of idea of he's a man who's lived through all this history and now he's teaching it. And I like that a lot. I thought that was a lot of fun. And he gets into this argument with this one guy who's attending the lecture, and he actually recognizes him from the past as this French officer in Napoleon's army when they were invading Russia that he had a spat with, and he was the one who killed him and brought him back into immortality, only he came to in a pine box under 6 feet of dirt. And I found that to be really interesting, and that he's basically there to settle accounts with MacLeod. And the flashbacks are interwoven with that and the lecture about the Napoleon's invasion of Russia, which I thought was interesting. However, this part brings up some weird, once again, a weird version of the rules where I don't understand how they work. Like, they bring up the idea that they don't fight on holy ground because they don't know where they come from. They don't want to piss off any potential deity. Only, what's considered holy ground seems to be really fluid and ridiculous here, because apparently the entirety of the campus of this college is considered holy ground. Not for any real reason other than because there's just lots of crosses everywhere. Like, the cross emblem is all over this place because it's a Jesuit-owned school, and I can understand a church being holy ground. I can understand, like, a rectory or something being holy ground, but the entire university? I don't buy that in the slightest, considering I've been to a university. I know what goes on there. And that's weird, and then so he has a fight with this guy, because he has to go retrieve a sword that he hid a few decades ago, because, he hasn't fighting in a while. And he fights the guy, and they introduce this idea that immortals use firearms in this script, and it's something where it's not a huge deal because it barely comes up as being really all that important. They're never really used in any significant way aside from like one or two places. But it's a weird complication of the rules of the Immortals, and it would make the action seem less distinct, I think. And so he fights this guy and then kills him and then actually disposes of the body, which is interesting, and dumps it in the river. And this leads into the other weird thing about the rules, because he goes and meets this immortal friend of him named Julian. And once again, you have something where it's like he works as like an apothecary and will stitch up an immortal's wounds for them. And first of all, how does this work within the rules that he can go around doing this and never have to fight another immortal? And why do the immortals get wounded and then they have to be stitched up? It feels like it's an attempt to make the immortals seem more vulnerable, but it's just weird, and that whole thing continues on throughout this script, because you have an immortal who is missing his legs somehow. Like, how does that work? And why are you so easily able to wound these guys so badly, and yet they don't die? I don't understand that. And Julian is a fairly interesting character who's this guy who doesn't fight. He very much just likes to enjoy life, and it leads to this interesting bit where they think the gathering is going to happen in New York, and so he tries to hoodwink McCloud and kill him later on, because he doesn't want to be able, because he knows, like, hey, you're a good fighter, I'm not, so I just have to take you out now. But then McCloud gets the better of him, and then just leaves a sword there, and goes, with sort of the intention of being, you're going to have to fight anyways. I thought that was, but I just find the whole apothecary thing really weird, because how does he do that and still survive? Like, how is he not getting constantly ambushed? So yeah, you have that, and things with the setting I don't really get. I like Connor McCloud's character in this because he's very much trying to live a peaceful life, because it establishes, his wife Heather tells him, you don't have to fight if you don't want to. You can choose to lead the life of a good, peaceful man. But then you have Ramirez going, oh, but you have to do this because, someone's gonna come after you eventually. The only thing is, though, is that I don't really feel like that character arc of him sort of learning to, be both a peaceful man and sort of accept his place really works here, because they set that stuff up and then puts down, and then like the way his fight to Kurgan ends up going, he still kills him, but it's weird that he apparently uses like this bit of deceit where he puts down his sword and then tricks the Kurgan and then cuts his head off. But they frame it like this is somehow him following his wife's wishes, so his wife wants him to be a dirty trickster? I really don't understand that in the slightest. So yeah, his character arc is a little weird and could do with a little cleaning up. As far as the flashback stuff goes, it's mostly pretty cool, and it's sort of the same as the original movie where he meets Ramirez and they train him. One difference that I do really like here is the relationship he has with Heather. Is that she's his wife before he gets wounded and is outed as an immortal. Whereas in the original, he had like his sweetheart or whatever, I think her name was Kate, or something, it was something like that, and then she just, as soon as he comes back to life, she just goes completely psycho on him. It's like he's in league with Lucifer. And I actually did really like what they do with Heather McCloud here, because they're married before the first death or whatever it is happens, and she sort of like leaves him at first after, because she doesn't go with him when he flees from the village. But then she shows up and finds him later feeling that she made a mistake and she has to put it right, and they stand by each other for the next 30, 40 years. And I thought that was a really interesting way to show their relationship, because in the original movie, he has that woman go psycho on him, and then basically skips ahead 5 years later and he's with Heather, and that worked. But this is definitely an interesting spin on that. And I like how her and Ramirez have sort of this mildly antagonistic relationship where they have different ideas of what they think Connor should be, but they don't outright hate each other. I thought that was nicely done. And her death scene in this is different, where they fled because the Kurgan found them, and after he kills Ramirez like he does in the original, they flee to Holland, where she dies of the plague like 30 years later. And then he comes back to Scotland to bury her. And it's still very sad and heartbreaking, but it has a different sort of spin on it, because as he's burying her, like right after he buries her, he senses another immortal coming to kill him, and he takes a swig of alcohol and goes, like, not even in this moment are they giving me any rest. So it gives it a darker edge to it. I thought was interesting. I preferred, the Who Wants to Live Forever montage to this, but I liked it. Another thing that's interesting is that I like how Ramirez is portrayed in the flashbacks, because they first meet in a pub in Edinburgh, because in this, instead of living in the middle of nowhere in this castle, MacLeod works as a smith in Edinburgh, which is interesting because in the earlier flashbacks when they're in the village, they all speak in Gaelic with subtitles, and then he learns English while he's in Edinburgh, which I thought that was pretty cool. I thought that was an interesting sort of transition, and kind of ambitious considering we seem to hate subtitles in this, the mainstream audience at least does, and I thought that would have been pretty cool to see. And it adds to an interesting progression, because he goes from this rural village to this medieval city, which isn't quite what we think of as a city, and then he ends up in the modern day, in an urban metropolis, and I thought that's an interesting progression. They're in a pub, and Ramirez is drunk off his ass, and he's hitting on Heather, and you find out later what he's doing is that he's trying to pick a fight with MacLeod and then take his head. But then MacLeod gets the better of him and then spares his life, and so the next morning, Ramirez shows up at the smithy and says, hey, you spared my life when you could have killed me. I'm going to return the favor and, explain immortality to you and train you and stuff. And I really, really liked that. I thought that was interesting. Definitely a different spin on the character. Now, there's one thing about Ramirez I'm not fond of, and this is something that the script does a lot of, where it'll do these tiny little flashbacks, and there's a moment where, because in the original, Ramirez tells MacLeod about his wife, the Japanese woman Shikiko, who she died, and he felt very sad about that. In this, they do this weird thing where he's married to her and then she kills herself so he doesn't have to see her die. No, he just has to deal with her suicide. Like, that's a weird character motivation right there. It just reads weird. And so, yeah. And so their flashback stuff is pretty cool. I like the training, and there's a bit where Ramirez explains that he's helping MacLeod train in firearms, and he says, you want to, take advantage of whatever you can to have an edge over your enemies. And I thought that was pretty neat, although, once again, my thing with the usage of guns in this script is that it doesn't amount to a whole lot, and just the idea of these ancient warriors using ancient techniques in a modern day is a lot more interesting than guys who have swords, but they also use guns sometimes. I don't know, I feel like it's something that a director could come in and say, hey, write that out. It doesn't quite work. And so, Ramirez in this, he comes very close to convincing MacLeod to leave Heather. And MacLeod is just about to walk out the door when the Kurgan comes, and then in this, what happens is that, because in the original, MacLeod's away, and then the Kurgan attacks their dwelling place, and then Ramirez gets killed and Heather gets raped. What happens here is that the Kurgan's outside, and then Ramirez draws him away into a fight and then dies, and they come back and they find the headless body on fire, which I have to get back to that later because it's something stupid that happens in the ending of this. And so he decides we have to leave, and that's how they end up. So yeah, that's the flashbacks. And I like the flashback stuff in this. It was like the original, but different. I still think it worked. And it reminded me of, the bit in the original where they're training on top of the rock, and then it's the conclusion of the training, basically, where he can finally defeat Ramirez at swordsmanship, and then, the sword goes flying off the cliff and Ramirez looks down, and I just imagine Sean Connery going, your dumb ass is gonna have to go get that now. But yeah. And one thing that's actually interesting is that they do bring up the whole thing about Ramirez being an ancient Egyptian originally, and what he says here is that he was a slave during the reign of Khufu, the pharaoh who built the Great Pyramid. And then when the Kurgan shows up, he says to Ramirez, Khufu, the great pharaoh, I haven't seen you in a while. And then Ramirez says, I don't go by that name anymore. I thought that was an interesting idea. Granted, it doesn't go anywhere, but I like the idea that Ramirez is the Pharaoh Khufu who had this great pyramid built for his tomb, and then he never actually died. I thought that's actually really interesting. And throughout this, you get flashbacks where MacLeod is hunting down the Kurgan, essentially. And he was going to Russia during the Napoleon's invasion to find the Kurgan specifically, and they eventually they meet and they clash during World War I. And then there's an explosion which separates them, and MacLeod comes out of the dirt and he doesn't find the Kurgan, but he finds his sword, which he then eventually donates to a museum, and he assumes the Kurgan has died. However, and that leads to a weird thing where apparently during the course of this script, the Kurgan has been in prison for 50 years. He serves a full life sentence. And apparently nobody in the prison noticed he was immortal and not aging, because according to the script, he's really good at faking and acting old, which I don't understand how that works in the slightest. And I don't understand why MacLeod and the Kurgan, who have this big feud between them, never ran into each other in like the 40 years between when he would have been in World War I, and when he went into prison, because this takes place, so it has to be the modern day of, well, 2009 when it was written is what I'm going by. And then, so 50 years would take him back to, what, 59? So that's about 40 years worth of history where they just never saw each other, which I don't get. So you have that, and pretty much what happens is that the Kurgan gets out of prison, and then he wants to go looking for MacLeod, and so he goes to this guy called Skinny, who's a southern immortal who lives in Texas, who became immortal during the Civil War. And that was a nice little brief flashback it had. And he lost his legs, and so he's traded immunity from fighting until the Gathering begins in exchange for helping create new fake identities for the Immortals, which I think is a good idea. I think it addresses how they're able to hide in the modern day, that there's this guy who's just working for him, and he's surrounded by Texas Rangers with guns, and so the Kurgan comes in and bribes him into helping find where MacLeod is, and it doesn't work because MacLeod's gone off the grid, and so he decides, fuck it, I'm just gonna take this guy's head anyways, and he goes to his car, and he pulls out an RPG and blows up the house so he can get through all the Texas Rangers and then chop off Skinny's head. Now, that's the one part of this where the gun stuff was actually pretty cool, because I can totally see the Kurgan doing that, just blowing a building up to just go easily take a head without resistance. I thought that worked alright, but the rest of the gun stuff is just really perfunctory, like when Connor learns that the Kurgan is coming back, he sets up a huge sniper rifle at his window to keep an eye out for him, and I'm like, and he never actually uses it, so it's like, what's the point? But yeah, I like that bit, and he figures out through a bit of deduction that MacLeod is in York. And the Kurgan, while I'm at him in this, I like how he's a very clever character, and I like how he has this sort of creepy, sort of dead, blank stare feel to him whenever he's around, very different from the original version. However, it tries to characterize him and expand on his backstory, which admittedly isn't necessarily a bad thing. But it's not really all that well done here, because you find out that basically the reason why the Kurgan is such a kill-crazy bastard is because during life he was a violent criminal, raped, stole, robbed, and killed. And then when his father, the village elder, had him hanged, that destroyed all of his faith in humanity, and he believes that they all deserve to die. The whole Sweeney Todd thing, I guess. And it's really weak. It makes him come off like a whiny dude with daddy issues. Especially when he goes off on a rant saying, they're innocent, like the father who had his son killed, and the people who came to watch, no, they deserve to die. I'm like, okay, you're about as threatening as the nihilists from The Big Lebowski. That was something that really, it's like, okay, yeah, like I appreciate the attempt, but it doesn't work. That part needs a rewrite. And also what's going on in the modern day is that they include the romance with Brenda Wyatt, but it plays very differently here. And in this, she's the owner of like an antique store. And MacLeod, like sheer coincidence, sees in the window this heart-shaped charm that he gave to Heather on their wedding day, and she gave to him for protection when he went into battle. He lost it while fighting the Kurgan, and he sees it in her window, and they meet. And it's, once again, it's kind of a perfunctory romance between the two of them. Like, they don't play it up as like a huge deal in this like the original did. It feels very much like it's the start of a relationship more than anything, but at the same time, it does feel perfunctory, and she does still get kidnapped by the Kurgan and stuff. So yeah, there is that. And so pretty much what happens there is that the Kurgan comes back to New York, and he kidnaps Brenda because apparently he somehow managed to be in the same room as MacLeod and another immortal, and neither of them noticed him. They didn't sense him like they should have, and so he noticed MacLeod talking to Brenda. And so he kidnaps her and holds her hostage in the art museum where MacLeod donated the Kurgan's sword to. And they end up having a bit of a fight in the museum, which was awesome, even if I spent this whole time wondering what happened to the immortals having a sense of discretion. Seriously, that's something I've always wondered about. I wondered reading the script, because in the original, they do fight in semi-public places, but there's always like a sense of concealment to them, like there's not that many people around, like Cassigear and the Kurgan fight in the back alley. Connor and that guy, I believe his name was Facile, they fight in parking garage where no one else is around at the moment. But in this, it's like they're just going at it in the middle of an art museum with security cameras and shit. And it's just like, it's cool that they're fighting with all these old weapons and stuff that they get out of the display cases, but it doesn't quite work. And then two other immortals show up out of goddamn nowhere. One of the security people is a woman who is also an immortal, and then one of the firemen who shows up in response to the fire alarm is also an immortal. They both get killed by the Kurgan. And then Connor and Brenda manage to escape, and then there's like a teenage girl who's called the Yearling, whom she's an immortal, and she throws Connor McLeod in front of a fire truck. And he gets splattered and taken to the hospital where eventually he heals and gets back up, which makes me wonder, why do you need stitches and shit? So yeah, that's really, really weird. Like, and then this battle, which admittedly was pretty cool, it gets seen on the news all over the world by about 15 different immortals, I believe. Like, there's one from Japan, there's a fencer from England, there's a Brazilian woman, there's a bunch of them. And so they see that and they get the idea, ooh, the gathering is happening, so they all go to New York. And meanwhile, I like that Connor and Brenda don't immediately fall into bed with each other in this, which is an improvement, because in the original, he, like, reveals his immortality by having her stab him, and then they immediately fuck, which is just weird. I said just weird way too many times. And here, they kind of start up a relationship, they have one kiss, and that's it. And I thought that worked a little bit better. He has an auxiliary apartment, because his main apartment, the cops figure out who he is and go there, and they read his little journals about his experiences as an immortal. And so there's that, and eventually the cops follow Brenda to his other apartment, and then they arrest him. And so he's in like a holding cell at the police department while the gathering begins, because basically they have this thing set up where they're going to go wait on holy ground, and then start things up for everyone to show up there, including McLeod, before they start things off properly. Which I thought that was a pretty interesting bit where they're sitting in the church and the tension's building. I didn't mind that bit. Now, the whole McLeod gets arrested thing, I just feel like that adds way too much complication to the plot. And the cop who's in charge of the investigation, Lieutenant King, is a guy who got shot in the line of duty, went in for surgery, and while he was recovering, they discovered he had lung cancer. He has cancer, they don't say which kind, but I'm assuming it's lung cancer because they mentioned he used to smoke. And he says, and he gets a character arc, which doesn't actually start up until really, really late. Like, the script is like 3/4 over, and he mentions that he has cancer, and he doesn't want to do the chemotherapy thing, because, you know, he wants to just die. He wants to enjoy what little bit of time he has left. I seem to recall Walter White having a similar speech in season 1 of Breaking Bad. It's not as good here. And then he has this thing where he sees, because he keeps insisting no one lives forever, and then he sees, you know, the quickening when Connor kills the Kurgan at the end, and he's like, and that somehow inspires him to go get treatment from a doctor. It's just, what? I didn't really get that. It just didn't click. And so yeah, eventually Connor kind of bullshits his way out of the holding cell by starting a fight and then tricking the cops into coming in and shutting them in with the criminals, and he gets out of there. And then what happens in between then is that the Kurgan sets up this plan where he persuades, via threatening family members, persuades like the cardinal who's in charge of this church where they're meeting to perform a decommissioning ritual on it so he can jump in and then say it's no longer holy ground, so he can catch the other immortals off guard, and he does manage to kill all of them, including Julian, and including all the other ones who showed up. On one hand, I think it's a pretty clever idea, and it makes the Kurgan look really smart and calculating. On the other, once again, it muddles the idea of what holy ground is, because, like, yeah, like, they'll accept things like stone circles and graveyards as being, but what's weird here is that in this script, they'll accept a university that's only holy ground because it has a shitload of crosses on it, but a decommissioned church doesn't count? The holy ground rule is just needlessly muddled by this, and blah, 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 but the fight scene inside it is okay. It's a clever idea, it just doesn't quite work. And then so the Kurgan bullshits his way out of there because the police are surrounding the building. One cop goes in, the Kurgan kills him and puts on his uniform and then slips away. I doubt that would work. And then Connor and the Kurgan have a fight, and they decide, fuck subtlety, we're gonna fight in the middle of a subway station, and that spills up into the streets, through a coffee shop, where there's this weird bit where a guy is typing on a laptop, and he clutches his laptop to his chest as the guys go fighting through it. And then Connor and the Kurgan, they fight back into the streets, flip over a wall in the Central Park, which I'm guessing that's the wall from Men in Black when Will Smith was chasing that guy and the guy flipped up the wall before going into that art museum. So yeah, they're fighting in Central Park. They're fighting all the way through there, and McCloud's kind of getting his ass handed to him. And then they end up at Belvedere Castle, this whole, the idea of the past still existing in the modern day. It's that little castle that's in Central Park. Neat idea. I actually kind of like that idea for the setting. It's different from the Silvercup Studios thing, but I like it. And so they're fighting, and then Connor and the Kurgan. Connor does that weird little trick thing, which is meant to somehow be him accepting his wife's ideas and still being a fighter, which doesn't make sense. And then chops off the Kurgan's head, and then there's the quickening of all quickenings. And I should point out that the script itself in the directions says the gathering has begun earlier on when all the immortals assemble. And then you get the thing with the police detective going to the doctor to treat his cancer, and then it cuts to Connor and Brenda are in the Edinburgh pub, which it's the same pub from centuries ago where he first met Ramirez, and they're talking, and he's talking about his past. And then he feels another immortal in the room, and looks over, and he sees Ramirez. And they have a talk, and Ramirez says that, because last time you see him, you saw the Kurgan going in for a killing blow after they rolled down a hill. And he reveals that they rolled down the hill into a cemetery, so that saved his life. Which just makes me wonder, who the fuck's headless body was that they found? I don't get that, and why did the Kurgan think that was the gathering when he knew he hadn't killed Ramirez? I don't get that at all. And then I almost said Connery. Ramirez, he says that wasn't really the gathering, what happened in New York. They just wanted to get the Kurgan out of the way before the real thing happens. And apparently he manipulated Connor into getting rid of the Kurgan so they could do the real gathering. And then he says, this is the beginning, and then it ends. And that raises so many questions, like, whose body was that? Why didn't the Kurgan know Ramirez wasn't dead? Why didn't the Kurgan realize that there has to be a shitload of other immortals out there that aren't dead if that wasn't the gathering? Why didn't these other immortals know anything? Why did the script itself say that the gathering has begun when it hadn't actually begun? It's a complication that doesn't need to be there, and just muddles everything. That ending is absolute crap, and it brings down a pretty good script. And it takes a good script that's pretty good, just brings it down for no reason other than because we wanted to do a twist ending. Now, I'm perfectly okay with leaving it open to a sequel. You don't want to trying to make a sequel to something as final as the first movie proved pretty fruitless. But this was a really clumsy way of doing it. There are so many other things they could have done. Like, just what I would have done is I would have made it the personal feud between Connor and the Kurgan, which then ends. And then you get a little tag at the end saying, oh, the gathering is coming now. That's what I would do to set up a new series. Make it a little self-contained story about Connor feuding with the Kurgan, and then lead into the gathering for the next movie. That's the perfect idea for it. But that's not what they did. They did something really stupid and convoluted. Now, I do like the idea of like a bunch of different immortals showing up from all over the world, because that's one thing I've always found was really odd about the original film, is that considering it's all of the immortals left, Gathering is surprisingly tiny. Like, 6 guys show up because you have Connor, the Kurgan, you have Connor's friend Castigear, you have Facile from the parking garage, you have a guy who was killed in New Jersey that's mentioned briefly, and it's presumably the Kurgan chopped his head off. And then in a deleted scene that's forever lost because of a fire, there was a scene where the Kurgan fights an Asian immortal who fights with a 2-handed sword technique. So yeah, that's 6 guys showed up for your gathering. Not exactly impressive if that's supposed to be all of them. So yeah, that's good improvement, but if it's not the gathering, it just raises so goddamn many questions to the point where it's like, why does the script specifically say that it's the gathering? Why do all 15 of these dudes think it's the gathering? Wouldn't they know if it wasn't? What the hell has Ramirez been doing all this time? Where has he been? Whose body was that, like I said? So yeah, this Highlander remake script, it's a good script. It just needs some severe improvements to the ending and a few tweaks throughout, and you could have made something interesting out of it. Now, as far as the status of the actual remake movie, sometime around 2011, I think, it was Juan Carlos Fresnadillo was attached to direct, and the thing he's best known for is 28 Weeks Later, which was an alright sequel to a pretty damn good movie. It's not anything special, but it wasn't terrible. And Ryan Reynolds actually signed on to play Connor McCloud, but they both dropped out for reasons that aren't specified. And now it got handed over in 2013 to Cedric something, I can't pronounce his last name, he was a second unit director and the special effects guy on Snow White and the Huntsman, and he hadn't directed a movie before. He has now. He just this year he did The Huntsman Winter's War, which I heard was god-awful. So yeah, maybe he's not the best choice. And a while ago there was talk of Batista playing the Kurgan. I don't know how I feel about that. I mean, I like Dave Batista, but I don't know about him as the Kurgan. It seems like an odd choice. Apparently this has been rewritten several times. Like, I believe David Abramowitz, who was a writer for the TV show, worked on it, and some other people were associated with it, including Melissa Rosenberg, who was the showrunner for Jessica Jones and also adapted the Twilight books to film, but that's neither here nor there at this point. And also, they apparently wanted Tom Cruise to play Ramirez at some point, but I'm pretty damn sure that won't be happening. So yeah, a Highlander remake, I'm open to the idea because frankly the series can't get much worse than the source. So yeah, I'm willing to give it a shot. But this script is not quite where it needs to be, even though I did ultimately mostly like it. So, yeah, that was the Highlander remake, and that's the 15th episode for you. Don't forget to check us out on Facebook, Tumblr, and Twitter. I have an iTunes page now, so go check that out. And also, if you have any questions or comments, contact the show at screenplayarchaeology@outlook.com. And until next time, guys, bye!